I met Lance Larsen for the first time on a hike in Capitol Reef National Park. We were on a hiking writing retreat for writing students and professors during the first few weeks of the semester at the beginning of the MFA program. On one hike, Lance and I happened to be walking next to each other. After a quick name exchange, I somehow found myself telling Lance stories about my life. Lance listened kindly as I told him, among other things, about my dad's obsession with bells, big ringing, singing bells, and the huge bell hanging on the balcony of my family's home. I mentioned that my dad used to ring the bell to call us kids home from neighborhood corners where we played with friends. At that moment, he paused and said, "I know you. I've heard this exact story before. Have we met? Or maybe I've read something you've written. Have you written this story?" And I told him that we'd never met, and as far as I knew, I'd never written it. But he insisted, really drilling me. Are you sure? Are you sure you haven't written this? I've read it. I know your dad. I've read about your dad somewhere. Eventually, we made the connection that Lance had been the study abroad professor in London while my older sister was there. While in London, my sister had written a story for his class that described our family bell and the ringing and our running home. I can't help but marvel at a poet who reads a student's assignment and then years later recognizes the characters and scenes in a random conversation with another student. That kind of attention to the details of the world is what makes Lance Larsen a poet and a person worth emulating. Lance's poetry is filled with this uncanny attention to the world. He packs his poems and essays with vivid, visceral images that connote much wisdom, depth, and spirit, and these details are mixed in with a solid dash of wit and more than a dash of brains. His vibrant writing is work that over and over again strikes me as profoundly vital and simply lovely. Lance Larsen's fourth collection of poems, Genius Loci, was published this year. His work appears widely in all the best places, and he's won all the best awards. We can't list them all. But just this last year, Lance Larsen was named to a 5-year term as the Utah Poet Laureate. He is married to the delightful artist Jackie Larsen, whose work accompanies much of his. I recently bought his newest book of poetry at the launch of his book, where Lance was signing. Within each book, he jotted a brief poetic stanza composed for the occasion. For some reason, it seemed like just the thing that I've come to expect from Lance, a thoughtful attention to the moment and to the people hiking around him. Please join me in welcome Dr. Lance Larsen.
Thanks for that generous introduction, Laura. As happy as I was to have the mystery resolved, the bell mystery, I was a little disappointed too. Up till that point, I was kind of agnostic about things like that. And I thought, well, this is happening. This has already happened to me. I've experienced this in another life, and now I'm experiencing it now. So I was disappointed to find out that it was. No, I wasn't that disappointed. In any case, and then a prayer by someone else named Larsen. Of course, she says that she prayed that you would learn a whole lot from me. I don't know if that's ever been uttered at a poetry reading before. So pretty tall order. I thought I would start by mentioning a phrase from a book by Eduardo Galeano. The book is titled "The Book of Embraces." This is a quote from a section of the book titled "Celebration of the Marriage of Heart and Mind." Why does one write if not to put one's pieces together? From the moment we enter school or church, education chops us into pieces. It teaches us to divorce soul from body and mind from heart. The fishermen of the Colombian coast must be learned doctors of ethics and morality, for they invented the word senti pensante, feeling, thinking, to define language that speaks the truth. And it seems to me that this is the project of poetry, really, it's a forum, an opportunity to put us back together, as it were. So I hope our time together can make some tiny inroads toward doing that. Some of you may be new to poetry readings. Is there anybody for whom this is their first poetry reading? A couple of hands are going up. Okay. You're probably nervous, huh? Right? How do you behave at a poetry reading? Well, I always try to reach out to the one, So I have written a poem for you. This is called Etiquette at a Poetry Reading. Settle into your surroundings greenly, like a houseplant in a new apartment. Listen with your eyes. Watch with your ears. Taste the air with your favorite memory of candles in paper sacks flickering along your driveway during a snowstorm. Yes, in a sense, we are all part of a collective Bildungsroman, verbing our way out of childhood in a transitive manner. But this does not mean you should rub the knee of your neighbor. Duende is as duende does. Mantras, yes. Astral projection, yes. Synchronized swimming in the aisle as applause, no. If a poem is titled White Noise, do not hum in the background. If a poem mentions Mae West and Northern Lights over Vermont, do not claim the same thing happened to you, only in Shreveport. All poetry is a black box. You enter as capitalist urges trapped in flesh. You exit as a feather. Enter as envy, exit as a white rabbit. Enter as a case of measles, exit as a volcanic rock from craters of the moon that will float in your own bathtub. If you must exfoliate, do so discreetly. Avoid explaining how you are related to the poet, even if you possess an embossed family tree and 4-generation charts to prove it. Poetry is the closest many will come all week to transubstantiation. So breathe communally. All things are spiritual unto me, saith Jehovah. Pesto, trapeze artists, haiku about collarbones. Don't merely buy a book. Become a book, one that can be read with eyes open or eyes closed. If all else fails, cover yourself with suet and birdseed. Proceed to the nearest alley and wait for the golden crows. I'm going to mostly read from my new book, but I'm going to start with a couple of older poems. This first poem is titled Peach, and it's a Chilean poem. I may need to explain a couple of things by way of background. I mentioned 2 Nobel Prize winners. Pablo Neruda will be very familiar to you, but also Gabriela Mistral, both of them Chilean. I mentioned Allende. He was the socialist president of Chile until 1973 when El Golpe, the hit, took place, and he was taken out by Pinochet, backed by the CIA. A brilliant move on the part of American politics. What else do I mention? I mentioned the Mapuche Indians, who were famed because they never surrendered to European troops, and so they were seen as this sort of national landmark. So the speaker of the poem is a former Peace Corps worker who is looking back on his time in Chile with a certain nostalgia. Peach. Call it treason, but I'm eating my way south. Chilean peaches swaddled in green tissue. I buy them $1.79 a pound in Kalamazoo in the teeth of winter. Tart enough, they bite back. By the shape, this one could be Allende's heart. I palm it. I lick its seams. Each day, I feel a little more Marxist. Think of peaches trundled to market on a scooter. Peaches filling a maid's mesh handbag. I once saw a girl in a catechism dress sliver off a piece for her brother. Her mouth to his. I never should have quit the Peace Corps. I happened to be dragging the wet part slowly across my cheek. If Congress would only try this, if the president of CBS, I'm ready to donate everything to La Leche League. I'm taking my first big bite. I wish I was mestizo. I wish I could cozy up beside those sad Easter Island faces. I want book titles running up the spine, not down. Whirlpools in the toilet, spinning the wrong way. It's firm, this peach flesh, with threads of blood and history running through it. Sometimes I think I'm a she. I want Reagan to remember everything he never was. Go ahead, count the letters in his name. Ronald Wilson Reagan, 666. All the U.S. can offer. South is always better. Chicken's in bed with you, a llama watchdog. I'm dribbling peach juice and learning to disembowel with a toothbrush. I wish San Martin could heal in English, that penguins would teach me how to carry eggs. I'm investing in copper futures and madly trilling my R's. On my taxes, I claim children named Maria de la Purísima and Jesus. And now I'm down to the pit, which I'm biting. An entire hemisphere in my mouth, Pablo Neruda between my teeth. I'm listening with the ear of a Mapuche Indian, closing my eyes to speak Hecha Bagucha Sicha. Rough translation, eat back guano, America. All made up, I admit, but I want their talk. I want those tough SOBs on my side. I wish Gabriela Mistral had nursed me. When I marry, it will be for exquisite black eyebrows and wide hips. When I conceive, I'll burn white, then red, then redder. This peach, sweet as 7 Edens and a peasant virgin, sweet as Chilean cowboys. Already, it's turning inside me. I'm going to read a couple of poems from Backyard Alchemy. And every chance I get, I try to show this cover off. This is the artwork was done by Jackie, my wife. There's a story behind this. When I was deciding on cover art, I sent my editor 3 or 4 possibilities because I always select her art when I have the opportunity. And he came back and said, yeah, we'd like to use this particular one. And he sent us a mock-up. And we're very happy about that, of course. At the time, her painting was in a Salt Lake gallery. And so we immediately contacted the gallery and said, don't sell that one, we want to hang on to it. We got a note back from them saying, we didn't sell it, but we've lost it. And they never found it. It's never been recovered. So if you ever see this painting, send me an email, because I would like to buy this. They paid for it, but that's very little comfort. I'd rather that it be in someone's collection or in my office. So I'll read a poem from that collection. It's titled How to Disappear. This poem is in a mode that I sometimes encourage my students to try out. That is a how-to poem written in second person. This little trick, I think, sometimes results in really engaging, vivid poems that students wouldn't arrive at otherwise. And so sometimes I try to practice what I preach. The setting for this is Rialto Beach on the peninsula, Olympic Peninsula, not far from Bend, the setting of that series of books by a former BYU student, an English major who didn't take a single creative writing class while here, who has become famous and who shall not be named. How to Disappear. Count rogue waves in their curling dresses carrying gossip from Jakarta. Feed yourself to a sea anemone, one finger at a time. Edit the afternoon and its ablutions down to one tiny pebble, a jewel or petrified tear. Remember how backwards you were before lunch, still lifting your wrist to tell time? Dragging your eyes across a mirror to diagnose beauty? Let a hermit crab or two scuttle across your foot. Then touch the pebble to your mouth. Search the driftwood till you find a dead seagull, chest hollowed out like a history of happiness. Roll the pebble inside your mouth while listening to the gull recite the only poem it knows, each stanza ending in wet feathers. Swallow the pebble, lick any splashes from your arm, and taste the here inside the not here. Soon your desire will darken into wind. The world is made of salt. If it wasn't bad enough that I already read one poem about poetry, it's taboo. You're not supposed to write poems about writing poetry, unless you're Billy Collins. Here's a second one. This one I think is perhaps a little more serious, I suppose. I consider it a kind of memo to myself explaining why why I keep writing poetry. The title is Why Keep at This Writing Thing. It also doubles as an elegy to a nephew of mine who took his own life. Why keep at this writing thing? Because with a 39-cent pen and a novice's grasp of the pluperfect, I can make an underwater kiss in 7th grade last till I retire. Because I can hang what-ifs on scraps of cumulus. Because my nephew unstrapped himself from time's wrist and slipped into a bottomless lake. Because reading Russian novels on a bus to the cloisters counts as research, as does deadheading a Gallica rose, as does rubbing a horse's face to understand the slow exhalation of trains. Let's be honest, my nephew didn't slip or let go. He dove, and I'm not ready to follow. Because saying no under my breath lets me say yes in my sleep. Because I want to thank Mary Magdalene and Orpheus in the same breath. Because in the middle of the Bay of Pigs, my mother turned off the radio, gave me one final sip, then buttoned up her blouse forever. Because 31 years later and 2 time zones later, my son said, "You be Jesus, and I'll be the tiger, keeping the wolves away." Because more of the people I love sink into the lake each year. Because I love each day differently. Because sometimes when I erase, I feel my nephew rolling his beautiful shoulders. Because when my mouth stops but the words go on, I hear him mouthing them, like a mother helping her toddler chew across the table. A couple years ago, Kate Coles, who's the former poet laureate, instituted a program for poetry titled, what is it called? Bite-sized Poetry. And she invited many poets from around the state to record by video one of their poems that's supposed to be shorter than a minute. And so I think Susan has a poem on there, Susan Howe and Kim Johnson, and several other poets. And so this is the poem that I chose for that occasion, and mine's a little longer than a minute, so I guess I was cheating. But I'm now famous because I'm on YouTube, which just cheers me to no end, I guess. Some minutes pinch us in a crowd. Some cheer us up. Some dangle us from the golden gate. Then, at the last instant, pull us to safety. Some minutes wobble, then rise, a homemade kite with a tail of torn pajamas. In some minutes you say, "I do." In some, you vow, "In this life, I would never." Some teach us the difference between oh and oh. Some say, "What's the use? We'll all get audited, whether by God or a flunky at the IRS." Minute 1, you believe in Bigfoot. Minute 2, you doubt your ability to boil water. Minute 5, you put on a paper crown. Meanwhile, minutes 3 and 4 join other unskilled minutes and compose a weekend trapped inside a snowy misunderstanding called Montana. In some minutes, a blind man reads by the light of his wife's snore. In some, a tiny girl peeks into a bird bath to see if she still has a face. Some minutes count mistakes at a recital. Some dream in neon blue. Some keep vigil with the dying and write down every pause and sigh. Napoleon whispers, "Josephine." Oscar Wilde says, "Either that wallpaper goes or I do." Anna Pavlova, famous ballerina, leans forward and squeezes your hand. "Get my swan costume ready." There's a quote that I like to mention in the classroom from Ezra Pound. He says that artists are the antennae of the race. Lately I've been talking about artists and writers being the flypaper of the race as well. It's when a writer opens up his notebook and starts to write, everything starts to collect there in miraculous ways. So for this poem, those last three things, I didn't even have to come up with. I just had to find them. So that's one of the things that I'm interested in doing is finding great quotes and finding some way to steal them or introduce them surreptitiously into my own work. Okay, I'm going to switch to Genius Loci. And let me just read the epigraph from a poet I very much admire. Her name is Elaine Equi. She teaches in New York. And this is the entire poem. It's also an epigraph. The air is full of secrets. Just by breathing, you become my accomplice. The air is full of secrets. Just by breathing, you become my accomplice. So the first poem in the collection is titled Chancellor of Shadows. Horses are praying the old-fashioned way, trotting a fenced field at twilight under a towel of moon. Swans settle on the pond like a 5-paragraph essay on beauty. Yes, we have our rituals, like the skunk stitching one pulsing patch of shadow to the next with the swish of its tail. Not to mention questions. How many broken pies at the bakery dream the forgiveness of hungry mouths? How many weeks till the silverfish chews through Chaucer? What if the other life is buried inside this one? A stack of bricks, a work shirt billowing on the line, epics in the making. Each set of doubts, a path. Like the owl, I'll take my wages in mice and falling stars. Take my midnights in the middle of the day. I'm fond of poems that have titles that are also questions. I've written, I guess, 3 of these. Tried some others that didn't work out. But what's great is if you come up with the title first, then you kind of know what you're writing towards if you come up with a right question. So this is another one in that mode. And the title is, Why Do You Keep Putting Animals in Your Poems? And I can't remember if I asked it myself or if it was, I think it was in an audience. Somebody was asking, probably a little exasperated. Aren't we done with the animals? No, we're not. So why do you keep putting animals in your poems? I open windows to catch a glimpse of grace on the horizon, and in they sneak. Coyotes and crows, pikas and the scholarly vole, dragging scoured skies I can see myself in. Much cheaper than booking a flight to the Galapagos. And these animals teach me. Badgers rarely invent stories to make them sad about their bodies, and the wrinklest of Shar-Pei never dreams of ironing its face. My happiness is like a flock of sparrows that scatters when a bus drives by, then restrings itself 2 blocks away, a necklace of chirps festooning a caved-in barn. Lemurs will bite a millipede to release narcotic toxins, then hand it to a neighbor, as if passing a joint at a concert. In a Rhode Island nursing home, Oscar the miracle cat curls up with residents hours before they expire, converting death into purrs for the next world. A poem is grave and nursery. The more creatures you bury in one place, the more hunger bursts forth somewhere else, like bats at Carlsbad when the brightest day turns dusk. The night I stood on my sister's feet and learned to waltz, a porcupine braved 4 lanes of asphalt and hurtling machines to chomp our windfall apples. 2 miracles of syncopation held together by a harvest moon. As Marianne Moore taught us, an hour at the Bronx Zoo in a tricorn hat leaves one happier than 9 months with a shrink. Comes a time you have to wiggle your pin feathers, wag your ghost tail, feel your teeth grow long for the ragged salmon throwing their bodies upstream. This one is titled Tired. I'm tired of the usual foofy dogs, West End musicals, Edgar Allan Poe. Also leather jackets and the posers who wear them. Believing a carcass across the back brings Hell's Angels cool. I'm especially tired of not having one myself. Tired of tragedy ending badly, gullible Hamlet taking the word of a rasping ghost. Tired of talk about the tinctured light of Provence and the sacred tintinnabulations of Florentine shadows, especially my own yak, as if I now grasped Renaissance metaphysics thanks to frequent flyer miles. I'm tired of the word tired. Shouldn't it drag along multiple syllabled, like remonstration or Jeremiad, drag with 11 vowels packed together and a Maori death sentence hanging over my head if I fail to pronounce each one? Tired, too, of diagrams explaining the collapse of the Twin Towers, but no mention of the kaleidoscopic flight of ghosts. Of course, I'm tired of time. Big Hen saying, Mr. Death, kahuna of all kahunas, he be waiting for you up ahead. Little Hen saying, never, never in this life. Meanwhile, some invisible sundial turning in my chest, like the Spanish Inquisition, counting lost seconds and saying, this heart, baby, it's all you got. Tired of remembering my brat of a niece, texting one of her dipstick friends the night my father died. Texting beside his rest home bed, when she should have memorized the stale air. Bruises on his arm, linked like the Great Lakes. The orange pad on the floor in case he rolled off. The way he twisted and bucked in his sleep, picking up one leg, then the other, as if climbing a mountain straight into the sky, not knowing which foot to put down next. This poem has a backstory. I remember taking it to my writing group. It was one big block, and they mostly liked it, which is never a given. After all, Susan Howe is part of my writing group. Just kidding. No, she's my favorite critic. And they made suggestions, some cuts because it was too long, et cetera, et cetera. And so I revised it and was getting ready to send this poem out. And I realized that I really wanted to send a poem or two, or a piece, not a poem actually, a nonfiction piece to Brevity, which is an online journal. I didn't have any nonfiction. So I looked at this poem and said, wait a minute, everything in this poem is true except for two minor details. And so I changed those details, dropped the line breaks, and sent it to Brevity as a nonfiction piece, just as this big block. It was about 500 words. The editor there, Dinty Moore, that's his real name, Dinty Moore. He read in our series, I think, last year. Kind of ironic because when I was in junior high, we had to choose a nom de plume. That was my nom de plume. I thought it was the silliest name in the universe. And I never thought I'd meet a writer named Dinty Moore. If he were here, I would not say this, of course. Fine writer, great human being, terrific editor, et cetera, et cetera. So I sent this piece to him, and about 3 weeks later, I got this email back. And he had accepted it. Of course, I was ecstatic and jumped up and down in my, well, no, I didn't, but just metaphorically jumped up and down. And then I did what I usually do. I sent Jackie an email saying, I just had this poem taken. What's funny is Dinty actually thinks this is a prose piece. It's really a poem. And then sat back in my chair and then realized, oh, I just sent that to Dinty Moore, not to Jackie. So what do you do? I mean, this was literally 90 seconds after the acceptance. Right? I composed a really quick retraction and said, you know, it's both at the same time. I just dropped the line breaks, but it's nonfiction, it really is. And he sent back a gracious letter, and I was afraid that he was going to unaccept the poem, which I've had happen before too, but not from him. So anyway, so it started out as a poem, became nonfiction. I actually published it as a poem in this collection because I had a poetry collection coming out. And if I ever publish nonfiction, I think I'm going to try to publish it again. Just get as much mileage out of the thing as you possibly can. Okay. This next poem is titled Magpie's Hop. And I have the opportunity, the luxury of reading all of, or most of Susan's poems about southern Utah before they see print. And so I think some of her wonder about that landscape rubbed off on me. So this is my attempt to sort of join the elite company who write about southern Utah. It's called A Magpie's Hop. Call us a hard, scrabbled people who trust seared air more than grace. How could we pretend otherwise in our fretted world of dust? We live by axioms of the gut. We witch for water, tender treaties with the sun, build crooked houses that mimic crooked skies. Who can explain a beauty so cleanly thin? A blouse of lichen takes centuries to sew. A magpie's hop measures the horizon's pull better than surveyors. Wind jabbers, amen. When will the desert blossom like a rose? The locust is our tormentor. The hummingbird, sipping nectar at dusk, our long-shot truth. Patience is an argument. Water always wins. See. Let me jump to, I think it's section 4, which consists of odes. I had the kind of silly ambition a few years ago of publishing a complete collection of odes. And I wrote probably 90 or 100 of them, but probably only a fifth of them were any good. And so I skimmed off the best ones. I was smart enough to realize not to pursue that too far. So I skimmed off the best ones and published them in magazines, and then it made up a section here. So I'll read a couple of those. This one is called To the Ode. True, you intimidate me, but when I slip you on like Horace's bathrobe, all things spark to life. An ant as worthy of praise as a phoenix, plastic cup as capacious as Grecian urn. Nothing too trivial for you, not clouds, not the bent spoon carrying gruel to the dowager's mouth, not spotted dogs in heat. Thanks to you, I talk to my orange juice before I drink it. I begin a Q&A with the rain, greed converted into awe. An ancient Mayan city behind my sternum. What is water but a confessor, happy to wash away my grit? What are train tracks but a ladder to heaven turned on its side? What is a rotting mouse but a country of flies buzzing with praise? This one is titled To Duende. And Duende is this charismatic power, almost like a god that inhabits us, or inhabits those who are Spanish. People like Garcia Lorca, people who can dance the flamenco, people who bullfight, et cetera, et cetera. There's this one story about this competition of flamenco dancers, and all the young and most talented women came out and danced around and showed their stuff. And then an older woman in her 50s, that's my age. Anyway, an older woman came out, and she had lived a pretty rough life, but she came out and didn't have the technique that they had exactly, but she had the duende, and she just, shamed all of them and won the competition. So I suppose this is also a poem of wishing that I was Garcia Lorca. To Duende. I've traced the face of a deer 7 minutes dead, cut the umbilical of my glistening sun. You blessed me in those days, why not now? You were the bones of my waiting, the blood of my hurry, the breath inside my breath. Wasn't it Lorca who said, you do not haunt the throat so much as climb from the soles of the feet? When will you climb through me? You bless flamenco and bullfights, never croquet. I will try more broken glass, more dark knowing. Teach me to scratch my doubts on cave walls and subway cars. Which totemic craving should I steer by today? I will hide behind banter and brie, weekend tete-a-tete, but inside, magpie, weasel, skunk, snake. Fire in the pocket, windstorm in the skull, you. the way a groan searches for a mouth, or a scream fills a pair of lungs, you. I will cut off the wings of my daytime angel, eat earth 3 days straight, drink rain from my dirty fur. This is a shorter ode to the Lord of sleepy places. And one of the questions you might ask, why is a Mormon using the dominant conceit of drinking wine in this poem? The answer is, I don't know. To the Lord of sleepy places. Taste me, Lord, the way a generous vintner tastes a so-so wine, swishing around his mouth what sat on the shelf too long, but had good color. Spit out my faults, breathe in cool air to set my smoky bouquet. Never mind, Lord, that I might have filled the best crystal goblets or been lifted to toast an epic journey. Enough if you taste me in the back of your throat while humming a blues line in a graveyard just after dusk to the blurred gossip of fireflies. Another Chilean poem. This one is titled Santiago Pluperfect. What do you need to know? I mentioned feria, which is the Spanish word for an open-air market. I mentioned a river that runs through Santiago called Maipú, and then Valparaíso, which is a coastal town, kind of the equivalent of their Hawaiian Islands, or maybe San Diego or something like that. Santiago Pluperfect. 3 kids kicking the bejesus out of a taped-up milk carton and calling it soccer. Pigs recycling rotten cabbages without being asked. What we drink in drinks us. In the feria, the melon man with a shriveled arm pushes a cracked honeydew off his stand. The splat of green flesh lets him send grabby urchins to hell while keeping them well fed for the trip. What burdens we bear us. Shortcuts home at an hour of pastoral chance to my hurry, past the Rio Mapu, past cows re-chewing their boredom under a tree. A piece of me hangs with the newspaper kite caught in the power line. Another piece slumbers in the graveyard in cement beds stacked 6 high. What skies we fish us. At the tracks, I copy a pair of wild-haired sisters and lay 3 pesos on the rail. Soon a train to Valparaíso will stretch the face of a dour liberator into something hot that gleams. I shopped for bread and accents this morning and carry home bread and accents. If angels lodge inside us, they feed on details, then retreat into hiding. This is a short one. Might subtitle it, What It's Like to Live in Springville, Utah. It's called Late Morning Salvage. And now a calico stray ankles along, begging me to pick her up and breathe her sacred groves. And now a ruby throat mistakes my striped shirt for Eden and tries to drink my bum shoulder. Ah, the pleasures of waiting like a peasant for the next life. I can almost hear the search party above dragging the lake. All curses and oars and grappling hooks, placing bets on how quickly I'll be found. I'm going to change things up and read a recent poem. This is it's a prose poem, but it's also a pantoum. The pantoum is a Malaysian form that made its way into English through French. It enjoys the great virtue of every line is repeated twice. The first line is the last line, third line is the third to last line, and all of the middle stanzas have 2 new lines and 2 old lines. So it's really quite an architectural endeavor. And when I wrote this, I thought, I want to write this as a as a prose piece, which is unusual. Usually it's written in quatrains. But I also wanted someone who didn't know what it was to realize that I had pulled off a pantoum. So I title it Pantoum for Trevin, Who Loves to Vacuum. 19 years old, going on 6, cocooned without words, he points to machines. Who can save us from dust? A static of birds, the sky churring yes. He points to machines and waits till you name each noise. A static of birds, the sky churring yes. He kisses the vacuum and waits till you name each noise. A ritual he lives by. He kisses the vacuum and the thrumming mouth begins to graze. A ritual he lives by, leaving swoopy trails in shag. Call this a test. And the thrumming mouth begins to graze, leaving swoopy trails in shag. The dirt we take up, the clean left behind. Another day, another vacuum. What stations we create, fermatas of longing, particles of God. Another day, another vacuum. Dark matter we pass through, fermatas of longing, particles of God. Just another boy gurgling like a storm. Dark matter we pass through. Who can save us from dust? Just another boy gurgling like a storm. 19 years old, going on 6, cocooned without words. I'll read one more poem. This is called Americana. I found her yard strewn with garbage, a confetti of junk mail and potato peels, trash can knocked over, and old lady Cooney herself in a purple kimono thing trying to clean up. Wild dog's done this, she said, followed by complaints about her Jack. Damn him, he gone up the mountain to shoot him another deer, and could you please... Who was I to turn her down? I was a paper boy, on foot, thrower of bad news. So I stooped and gathered charred toast, wallets of dryer lint, bloodied wads of TP, grapefruit rinds like speckled snakes. When she handed me a badminton racket, I thought, a gift? Why not? I've earned it. Then she motioned me to the fence and pointed. Lying in a bed of scraggly mums, a deer head, prim as a handbag, but chewed, one eye missing, the other staring across frosted lawn. She knew boys like me were brave in stupid ways and wouldn't mind using a racket as a spatula. So I scooped up that face and carried its soft ears and final grimace across the yard. Carried it. We're always auditioning for something. Old lady Cooney, a little respect. That partitioned deer, a blind date with eternity. Me, paperboy of the decade plus tips. Which is why I carried its face like a torch. Not in the trash, she said. That would bring the dogs again. I followed her into the garage instead. To the freezer, which gasped in white, a cauldron filled with dry ice. I settled that face atop a bed of frozen peas, and she closed the lid. We traded then. I handed her the racket handle first, and she buried me in thank yous. Then I trudged back into that cold masquerading as Sunday morning. What I didn't know hung everywhere. Tricky Dick Nixon and the price of bananas from my shoulders. Secret lives from lit windows. I was a carrier worth 87 cents a day, plus rubber bands. Right arm 2 inches longer than my left. I looked back then and saw in the side yard the rest of the dough, upside down in an apple tree, tied in place with a blue jump rope, rib cage stuck open with kindling. What I breathed out was only breath, but felt like moths that climbed and dissolved, till I too circled that exquisite scarecrow of hanging meat, weddings and want ads banging my thighs. Thank you. I can answer a couple questions if you have some. Or refuse to answer questions. Please.
Multiple times you mentioned prose poems. What do you mean by prose poetry?
The best minds have been asked that question, and they can't really answer it, but I'll answer it in a simplistic way. Prose poems are creatures that do not have line breaks, and they borrow a lot of the tropes and techniques of poetry, dense language, metaphor, repetition, imagery, so that this piece, that though it's written as prose, is trying to say, I'm also a poem. We might call it a hybrid form. A friend of mine calls them double agents. Yeah.
Following up on that, I'm interested in your pantoum that you put out, you took out of lines. Can you tell me what purposes you're trying to achieve?
I've just, goofing the form. That's what Brian Doyle calls it. I've written a couple of pantoums and published them with line breaks, and I just thought, I've never seen a prose pantoum. Why not try it? It just seemed like it was more interesting, and not announcing what the lines were in advance, which is what a conventional pantoum in quatrains does. I just wanted to smash it all together so that the reader would pay attention to the language and not say, oh, this is the repeating line, this is the first line, this is the second line. So just an experiment. I tried it both ways, and I think it works pretty well as a regular pantoum, but thought I'd mess around. Another question? Yeah, in the back. Yeah, that's the question you always get. I never know how to answer it. The question is, which poets have influenced my style? There's a quote by George Seferis, a Greek poet, who says something like, I can't remember how he says it. I'm a lion and I've been eating lambs all my life, or something like that. A metaphor for what writers are always doing. How do you expect me to identify which lambs I've eaten, or something like that? I can tell you poets I love. I love Shakespeare, especially in the plays, even more than in the sonnets. Emily Dickinson, Whitman. I like Wallace Stevens, Elizabeth Bishop, Elaine Equi. I can name lots of people. Who's influenced me? I don't know. That's a good question. There's probably quite a bit of Philip Levine in my work. He's, for lack of a better term, a blue-collar, urban, Jewish poet from Michigan. And I think the only thing I have in common with him is that we're both poets. But I feel like there's something about his music and sensibility that I've probably picked up. Another question? Yeah.
You have some very vivid metaphors, comparisons in your poems, and I'm wondering if you just talk a little bit. When you create a poem, do you have like a list of metaphors that you compile that you think about and you notice throughout your daily life? Sometimes it's hard to just draw a metaphor right in the moment when you're writing something.
Yeah.
You sometimes
Yeah, what I tend to do, probably 15, 20 years ago, I would sit down and say, okay, now I'm going to write a poem, and I would try to write a poem at one sitting, go from beginning to end in a fairly linear way. I think that's how most people write poems, which is a terrific way. I noticed, though, that often I would end up skimping on the lines because I was too concerned with the made thing as a poem. What I tend to do now is sit down and just hoard interesting language. So I might sit down 4 or 5 times or 6 or 7 times before I even attempt to make a poem out of language. But when I sit down, then I have a page and a half or 2 pages of language. And I think of that as kind of the marble block, if you want to switch metaphors, to a sculptor. And I assume that the poem is somewhere inside that block, but I have the block already. I have a lot of language. And then I start chipping away and figuring out, okay, how could this poem end? Where does it begin? What devices am I going to use? I think Melanie Ray Tone does something like this in her fiction. She does a lot of pre-writing, she talks about. And so I think that's kind of what I do. So the process isn't, oh, can I come up with a metaphor, in the spur of the moment. It's more how do I distill this mess of language into something that resembles a poem. Yeah, please.
So the process probably differs, but how do you choose your closing images? I notice a lot of your closing images, like the ballerina's costume, the golden prose, and how do you write that end?
Yeah, great question. I think it was Forster, a fiction writer, who says that a good conclusion, and maybe he's borrowing from Aristotle, says something like, or Henry James, I mean, nobody's very original, says that a good conclusion is both inevitable and surprising. So that's one of the litmus tests I'm trying to apply to a conclusion. If I'm too deliberate about a conclusion, that is, if I'm writing a poem and say, okay, the poem is beginning here and it's ending here, I tend to overthink things, and the poem might turn didactic. So with this method of composition that I favor now, where I have this block of language and I'm moving things around, often the ending is already there. I just don't know it's an ending. And so when I put it in at the ending, it surprises me. There's a kind of wildness to it. And I'll just try out line after line. And I guess I think of my final process more as I think of myself as a collagist arranging lines. And so, or during a show of some sort, right? I have the lines, which ones are going to stay, which ones get booted out, and then rearrange until you come up with something interesting. But it seems as if I get better results that way than if I say, now I'm writing a poem, here's the first line, here's the second, here's the ending. One more question? Yeah, please. Yeah.
In your poetry, there's lots of these moments where you reference a family member or something like that, or someone dear to you. So I wonder, like, how they feel about that when they're reading a part of them in this poetic form that you put them in.
My wife Jackie tries to come to every reading, and she enjoys all of that notoriety in front of the crowd. She's sitting about 5 people over. She doesn't care for it too much, actually. It depends. I try to be tasteful, and there's some poems that I have written. Well, that's not true. If they're good, I usually try to publish them, whether the person that wants me to or not. I think in some the poems are celebratory in one way or another, and I try to be sensitive. I don't think we've had any major tiffs, but sometimes Jackie says, "Don't read that poem in front of this audience." It's fine. Thank you.